for Michelson Found Animals Foundation. We're based in the US. I'm the program director for Pet Inclusive Housing. Our focus is on working with owners and operators throughout the US primarily right now to think about their pet policies, how can they benefit from bringing more pets into their communities and embracing them more fully.
Thank you. Farouk?
Hi everyone, so my name is Farouk. I work for Quintain Living. We're an owner-operator build-to-rent company. I'm a resident manager, so I'm essentially responsible for approximately 500 apartments where we rent them out to residents, and I try and essentially improve and enhance their experience while they're with us.
And Caroline?
Hi, apologies first of all for not being there with you in person, but I'm Caroline, certified animal behaviourist. Over a decade of experience helping pet parents support their dogs while they're living in our very hectic human world. I'm the founder of digital pet coaching service Barketplace, as well as behavioural expert for several pet brands, and advise in the office space to help dogs and employees enjoy their time together. And we're just here at Barketplace, we try and improve connections between the human and hound so that they can have the best relationships. This can help, I think, in two very important areas when it comes to creating harmonious environments for your rental community, both those who live with dogs and those who don't. So supporting the challenge of barking, and also for those dogs who find it hard being left home alone.
Thank you. I do feel like Farouk and I have let the side down by not having puns of names, where we've got Ross Barker, and Caroline has Barketplace as her company. So to introduce myself, I'm Roger Southam. I'm International Business Development Manager for Poo Prints, which is dog DNA solving dog mess in your communities. Now, believe it or not, the dog population in the UK has grown from 7 million to 13 million over COVID. So anybody who thinks they're pet friendly probably isn't as pet friendly as they could be. And anybody who isn't embracing pets in their communities is missing a trick and a half. So what we want to do this afternoon is take a canter through the kind of, I suppose, the nice bits of how animals can be good for your community, and also some of the misunderstandings you may have in terms of breeds and bits and on the behavioural side. But to kick us off, Farouk, you had a great tale of something that was a nuisance but actually turned out to be hugely important.
Absolutely. So we had a number of residents actually complaining about a particular apartment, a particular resident, because their dog was barking, making quite a lot of noise all hours of the day and the night. So once we reached out to that resident to try and find out what's going on, we ended up finding that the apartment wasn't being kept in the best condition because, and as a result the dog was barking, was because the gentleman that lived there was actually mentally unwell. And he wasn't really taking care of himself, let alone the poor animal. And so what I think ostensibly kind of looked in the beginning as an issue of a nuisance animal was actually quite heartwarmingly, I think, a situation where the dog was actually alerting us, though probably inadvertently, that there was an issue that needed to be addressed. And fortunately, as a consequence of that, we were able to kind of speak with the resident, and eventually he agreed to move out and go to his family home, where he'd be able to get the kind of care and support that he and the dog needed.
Interesting. And from a behavioural aspect, Caroline, does that sort of resonate with you in terms of how people can misunderstand what animals are actually crying out for?
Absolutely. I think we need to be really mindful that our dogs are great communicators, and sometimes that communication can obviously be a little tricky for people who might be living in neighbouring quarters, but it can also provide some great support. And dogs can be lifelines for humans, particularly through loneliness. We know through kind of COVID times, obviously pet growth was so huge, and that was because people wanted to reach out and create connections, and they wanted companionship. And that's obviously something that living in the sort of rental space can provide, but also so can pets.
Interesting. And Ross, Found Animals do great work in terms of educating people about the misunderstandings of dogs. Do you want to talk a bit about breeds and why there is no bad breed?
Sure, there's a couple things that we focus on. So you mentioned and one of those, which is that a lot of restrictions are put in place based on breed and size of dogs, and this is very true in the U.S. And I think this is where the Roger said at the beginning that people think they're pet friendly, and in the U.S. we found that 76% of all rental housing operators say they're pet friendly, but then when you ask pet owners about finding pet-friendly housing, 72% say that it's really hard to find. So there's a disconnect there, and that is based on that definition. And a lot of it comes down to the breed and the size. So if I'm looking for a place to rent and I have a German Shepherd or a Golden Retriever that's 60 pounds in the U.S., it's going to be really hard to find rental housing, despite communities saying that they're pet-friendly. So that's one big disconnect. And then we look at the breed and size restrictions that are in place are based often on anecdotal information, kind of horror stories you read or see in the news, and it's just not borne out in the data, and it's just the stories that are chosen to be put out there and popularized. So,
yeah, interesting. And so, in terms of Quintain and your policies, have you got any restrictions on size and breed and?
No, obviously, in terms of breed, we will follow, the UK legislation where there's for particular breeds that we don't permit. But as long as pets, that particularly dogs, are well behaved, well trained, and if they're puppies, for example, where they have yet to kind of undergo that kind of training, as long as the pet owner, the resident, is confident that they can ensure that pet gets that training that they need, then there's no limits. We obviously do have a limit on the number of pets in one particular apartment, because there's always going to be issues where it's somewhat cruel or unfair to have four massive Dobermans or whatever the case might be in a one bed. But yeah, there's no major unreasonable reasons not to prohibit having pets in the apartment.
And has that been from day one, or has that been a learning curve?
I think that's been very much a learning curve. I think the policies, I think we realised quite fairly early on that we needed to have a robust policy in place that kind of takes on board not just the feedback, but things that we've learned as we've gone along. I mean, we haven't actually been pet-friendly for that long. I think we had our first pet-friendly building sometime in early, I think, 2018, and then all of them went pet-friendly early 2021. And so that's a relatively short amount of time for us to kind of figure out what the pitfalls were. But I think the largest takeaway that we found was, yes, we need a robust policy in place, but it was also having an open dialogue with pet owners, because I think by and large pet owners are actually quite responsible, and they are quite acknowledging of the fact that they need to kind of make sure that they are doing what they need to do in terms of looking after those animals and the environment that we will live in, the community that we all reside in and work in.
And how are you assessing how well behaved or how much the owner is responsible from day one?
Well, I think initially it was we would have kind of pet interviews when we were first going live, but just because of the sheer volume of pets and residents that we were getting, that became soon quite impractical. But we do insist that when residents before they move in, we hand over keys. They bring their pet along. We're able to vet them and make sure that we've taken swabs. And during that whole interaction, we get to know the animal a little bit more in depth, and we see that how responsive they are to commands. We can see how open and I suppose responsive to what we ask the owners to be in terms of our policy and signing it. They're all quite happy to do so, and so we kind of see that, and that's where we know we're confident that what we're doing is right and it's working.
Interesting. And from the non-dog owners or non-pet owners, did you get any concerns or worries or anxiety or any issues from that perspective? Has it turned anybody off, I think is the phrase I'm looking for?
No. I think you do now and get someone who might be afraid. In fact, we've actually had staff that have been afraid, around dogs. But just being close to them over time, we're finding that people are actually becoming desensitized to any fear that they might otherwise have, and are actually finding that actually it's not a problem. It's quite enjoyable. Just the other day, in fact, I had people in my own team explain to me that sometimes when they're having a bad day, as an example, having a resident's pet come by the front desk and they get to play with them and cuddle them and whatever else, it can actually turn their kind of mentality around and make them feel a bit better. So we're not really getting so much in terms of complaints or people feeling worried about it. There indeed can be cases where people might have allergies, as an example, and in those cases, our leasing team works incredibly hard to kind of try and work around that. So they might offer them, for example, a ground floor property, so they don't have to go into the lifts, which is a tight and closed space. So there are the kind of processes that we have in place.
Interesting. And with your online service, Caroline, I presume there's sort of behavioural training you can give to help in those situations.
Absolutely. I think from people who share their lives with dogs and helping them to support them in the best way so that they're going to live in the most relaxed way in those environments so that they can cope being, in an environment when they're at home alone or when they are meeting new people in a lift in a small space, or even for people who perhaps don't understand dogs very well at this point because they don't share their lives with them and they would like to understand them better. We offer things like body language training. So there's lots of ways that we can support the whole community to better understand dogs and better support dogs so that they can be then effective members of the community as well as the people who are living there.
Interesting. And Ross, from your perspective, in terms of, you've obviously not been over in the UK very long for this trip, but in terms of the US and the education process, how are you finding that going? And is it sort of pushing water uphill or quite receptive?
I don't think it's pushing water uphill. It's just, it's tough to make pets kind of a central issue, right? I mean, owners and operators are very busy with a lot of other concerns, right? And so making this issue into one that people can see the benefit from a profit performance, from a profit perspective, I think that's part of this. But I think that this community building that both Farouk and Caroline have talked about is really important, right? Because what we see from people that have made the jump to being more pet inclusive, and so we have used the term pet inclusive as opposed to pet friendly. We're trying to offer a different term that extends beyond just allowing dogs and cats. But for communities that have really become more pet inclusive, they have noticed a big difference in terms of the strength of the community. It gets people out of their apartments. It gets people bonding in a way that Farouk talked about. And I think if you can put those guardrails in place to make sure everybody understands the expectations, both pet owners and non-pet owners, then it becomes a very rich environment.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because actually, statistically, dog owners or pet owners will stay longer in a property than non-pet owners. So you get better retention. So there's your profit bit coming through and performance bit coming through. And also in terms of the disruption and all the concerns, they're kind of nowhere near as bad as people perceive or believe they can be in terms of scratching of furniture and issues like that.
No, absolutely not. I mean, we have, I think, top of my head, just over 3,200 properties, of which to date, approximately 425 apartments have pets. I think I can't give you an exact number as such, but the percentage of issues that we come across is almost negligible. And I think it's kind of speaking to Ross's point earlier, the issue very much lies in people feeling or not really realizing actually that the issue is quite central. It's quite an important thing of trying to, it's almost like a USP, isn't it, about how to differentiate yourself between your competitors in the market. And I remember reading rather intriguingly in the government's policy papers regarding a fairer private rented sector that 47% of landlords would be against having pets in their properties. And I think what that tells us is that there is a very distinct misunderstanding of all the opportunities that they are actually missing out on and losing out on because they're not opening their doors to residents. And again, to speak to your point, retention. People do stay longer if they have their pets.
Yeah, it is interesting. Sorry, go on.
I just want to just add on to that point. So in terms of, in our research in the US, we have seen, it indicates that only about 9% of rental units have any substantial pet damage or even enough to be noticeable. And the average cost of repairing any of that or dealing with any of that is about a third of the traditional security deposit, right? So you don't even need additional fees necessarily to cover most of what happens in terms of pet damage, right? There's always going to be the extreme cases, and if you talk to anybody, I'm sure you can hear about that one horror story they've had about having to replace all the carpets because of a cat that urinated every place, right? Those kinds of things. But those are really not the norm, right? And so from a business perspective, which we very much are trying to embrace, right? We're not just saying all pets all the time, right? It's got to be thought through, it's got to be considerate, it's got to be deliberate, and really make sense for everybody.
And Caroline, in terms of your programs, presumably you're able to offer into the communities a lot to give benefit to the owners.
Sorry, could you just repeat that last bit?
Yeah, in terms of your programs, you're able to offer a lot into the communities to actually help with the behavioural aspects, etc., etc.
Absolutely, and I think the thing for us is really trying to put in that preventative care rather than trying to fix challenges once they've arisen, educate so that anyone who is showing their life, in our case with dogs, they have that information to be able to guide them through the journey with their dogs, so that there aren't those pain points. And I'm loving hearing the ideas of the community, the retention rate with the guardians of animals, and I think also when we're looking at people who live with pets, they're more likely to be the people who spend time in those communities and time in the property because they're spending time with their animals. And so, from a safety perspective, from a community perspective, all sorts of things, you're going to have more people there a lot of the time, which I think is lovely as well.
Yeah, interesting. Certainly, I think I could put my heart on my sleeve at this point. We didn't talk about this when we were chatting before, but I used to be terrified of dogs. I mean, literally terrified. I had a Labrador bounce up at me when I was 2 years old and knocked me on the floor. And I was petrified. And bizarrely, I've now ended up working for Poo Prints, and I love dogs. It's insane. And I'm thinking back in terms of how on earth could I have been so afraid of them when they're actually such lovable, fluffy little things. So I kind of empathise in terms of the people who would be terrified. But that behavioural aspect and getting people desensitized and helping people through, because they're a wonderful, wonderful anecdote in terms of just stroking and petting, and they forgive everything. Way too much, probably.
They do, and I think I heard a little bit of talk today of in different sessions about building community and about isolation being an issue that is important to talk about. And I think that, as Caroline has said, having pets, if you've been around them in any sense, whether in the workplace or in your own life, outside of work, it's just adds an element that brings that to a new place, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And in terms of going forward, Farouk, how do you see the evolution in terms of, are you going to be looking at other, pet parties, ways you can actually integrate the animals into the community, into more activity?
Absolutely, because I think when you were referring to it earlier about how a lot of people or places might say they're pet friendly, but perhaps not as pet friendly as they think. And I think that's something definitely with at Quintain Living where we're trying to kind of lead the market. Well, I hope we are anyway. Whereby we're trying to make sure that our buildings have enclosed dog runs where dogs can run freely, off lead, and in a safe environment, creating larger ones in the public realm for larger dogs who need more space. But then we've also got things like a cuddle club, which is a company we've partnered with, and I think they've just opened, if I'm not much mistaken, I think yesterday, which is good timing, but where it offers services to residents where they can take their pets to, have like a day spa and have dog sitting facilities and things like that. And then there's also, looking at it from almost I think from a design aspect where, sometimes, when we design our buildings, so we forget, or we only think rather about how the humans will exist in them. And so if you look at a dog who goes out and it's rainy and muddy outside, and then their owners have to take them back and stick them in the tub, which is probably quite difficult, the larger the breed, and try wash them, and then you have issues with making a mess and perhaps even damaging the plumbing. What we've done is we've opened a laundromat. There's your pun, but whereby we can have residents go in, they can wash them, they can dry them, they can even use a wash dryer to clean the dog's toys or clothes and whatever else. So I think that's pretty much where this thing is headed, and I think the sky's the limit in terms of what what we could possibly do. I think we're only limited by our imagination here, what we could kind of use and integrate into our communities to kind of further enhance those experiences that residents have. It's not one or the other. It's not we have a space for people and we have a space for dogs. They're a family member. So we need to kind of find a way of integrating them both together. Where I think recently we've even had a pet parade, a fashion show of sorts, which was really fun because it's something for the dogs to do. But equally, it's something fun for the communities, the people to kind of meet each other and speak, which they might not have otherwise done. They might just go to work, go to the shops and come back home. So it's looking at it from a holistic approach as opposed to just an isolated, we're trying to give a place for dogs to exist.
It is interesting because in the US, of course, laundromats have been around for a long time in terms of kind of doggy daycare where you'd have the facilities for washing. Even in the airports, they've got little corral areas where the dog can use the loo. That's how many dogs are going through the airports in the US. But we kind of haven't really progressed that far here, but the BTR sector could certainly be leading the way and taking us forward. Any other examples on things like that you can think of?
I think the amenities are important. I think the most important ones are what we see, the most important ones, the most impactful ones are dog runs and waste stations. I mean, just it seems like a simple thing, but having enough of those around a property so that it's a lot easier for people to take care of their pets. But I also think that U.S. is not as far along as you'd like to think. Although 70% of households own pets, I mean there's still a lot of work to be done in this area. And I do think going back to the design and development perspective is really important, right? Because I think you can build in, make it easy for there to be an open area for dogs to run off leash, right? I know some places that have even gone down to the point of looking at the flooring they use and the walls that they put in place, right? Just to make sure that they're doing the best thing they can for pets, and then obviously things like pets on ground floors, right? I mean, just limiting the necessity of kind of the mingling for people that have allergies, that sort of thing.
And Caroline, anything you want to pick up on that from the sort of finishes?
In terms of obviously as setting up everything so it can be as smooth for the animals as well as the caregivers is just fantastic. And I think having those spaces where people can kind of get together as the dog community. I mean, they sort of say, if you want to make new friends in a new space, if you're moving to a new city, have a baby or have a pet, a dog, because they're the ones that get you out and meeting new people who live around you. And, when we moved back from Canada here to the UK, most of our friends we made through the dogs that we had. And I think that's something that is missed from a community, when people are sort of thinking, not sure whether it's a good idea to have pets in the environment, really focusing on that community aspect is something that could be missed. Interesting.
And any sort of specifics in terms of design and finishes that can make life easier?
Yeah, I mean, I love the fact that Ross was talking about even looking at flooring for our dogs. Some dogs, particularly elderly or puppies, could find it harder if there's very glossy, slippery floors. Also thinking about dampening sounds if you've got large entrance halls that are going to, echo a lot. That could be quite disturbing for dogs to move through if they've got any kind of noise sensitivities. So there's lots of things that could be offered. Also, making sure that there are stairways that are suitable for dogs if they find going up in the lift a new scary experience if they've not experienced that before. But I think from the practical point of view, the stuff that Farooq's talked about in terms of being able to wash your dog before you bring them in, all of those sort of things are just fantastic. And they're providing so much more than I could have ever imagined, I think, 10 years ago that pet parents would be able to get in living spaces.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Are you making a charge for the laundromat?
No, so there's not a charge for the laundromat as such, but there's we do have a pet license in place. Yeah. And we spoke about this before, so I kind of like to think of it as a form of road tax, or similar to road tax, in that it's a nominal fee that residents pay per month for the ability to have their pet in their property, in their apartment. But then we use that money to then help cover the costs of, for example, testing kits for like poo prints and giving them their pets a unique ID tag, maintaining all of the, you know, the enclosures, the dog runs and things like that. So that's what we use it for. Obviously, we're still also, you know, a business where we're aiming to kind of, you know, help invest back into the business and generate revenue in that sense as well. And speaking to an earlier point about missing opportunities for landlords, I mean, I had a look at the numbers the other day, and this is an approximation based on the average, pet license, which is, I think, £50 to cover pretty much everything. And, you know, we're able to generate somewhere in the range of, you know, £17,000 per month. Granted, that's you know, before any, you know, overheads come out, but it's a substantial amount. So you're looking at just, you know, just under 205,000 a year. So there's definitely a trick being missed, I think.
Yeah, go on.
And I think it's really important as we were talking about this, as we were preparing. If you have that sort of license, the advantage is to then say, here's what we do with that, right? So it's not so that your pet owners as renters don't just look at this as a grab for additional revenue, right? I mean, even if that's what it is, if you have specific things you're doing, you're adding amenities, you're making sure that the bags are stocked, right? You're putting in a laundry facility that they can use. Those things are really noticeable for people, and then it becomes much easier to accept that additional fee that they're paying, right? And it also makes people that don't have pets see that there's common responsibility here and that there's an expectation. The pet licensing also does that. It lets everybody know, hey, there's a set of expectations that we all have to follow, and it becomes more comfortable in the community if that's accepted.
And I think that flows right the way through in terms of the non-dog owners then feeling better looked after because they know that you're looking after the pets so well. The elephant in the room, or that's actually a hat. Talk about Mayu's thing earlier about humiliation. I'll go with that one for a second. Obviously, dog mess can be a nuisance, and I was kind of trying to avoid getting into this in terms of, but I think I'll have to do the blatant plug for poo prints and explain what we do. But there is a program out there that will actually aid that and help that, which is poo prints, which is DNA registration of dogs, which is great for lost and stolen dogs. Does health checks on the dogs in terms of hereditary disease as well. But then through the poo, you can actually analyse and find out who hasn't cleared up after their dog. So if that's a worry in terms of your pet friendliness, there's always ways rounds to solve it. Now, you've been early proponents of this, haven't you? You took it on board very early. Do you want to just talk?
Sure. I mean, yeah, so we did kind of adopt it quite early on, I think, and whilst it definitely has utility without doubt in being able to track these things, and there's certainly instances where we've had to find out who fouled and then didn't clean it up. But what we're finding, I think, and again proportional to the amount of apartments we have, the number of residents we have, the number of pets we have, we're finding that it works so very well as a deterrent. It works really, really well at that because we charge, if people don't clean up after their pets, we do charge £200. But again, it's something that, I mean, in my buildings, I've never had to levy such a charge. I know in other developments within Quintet Living we have, but again, very far and few between. Because I think, generally speaking, it's like, speaking to your point, A, it's there as a deterrent. B, people are conscious, and because everyone sees that we are trying to maintain, the fabric of our community, the fabric of our buildings, they themselves have a sense of pride, and they don't want to mess it up. They don't want to leave something like that, let alone get a fine for it.
Which is the huge thing, isn't it? Because it's all about demonstrating responsibility and sort of educating and showing the non-dog owners, the dog owners, that everything is all about them and all about service. Which comes back to the previous panel, where they're talking about customer service, but only on the human side, interestingly.
And the waste issue is a big one, right? And it's interesting, I've done some interviews in the UK as well as the US, and in the UK, from a nuisance perspective, the waste was a much bigger and more specifically mentioned issue. So I know it's an issue, and I think that services like this, processes like this can make a big difference. And I've mentioned a couple times just having enough waste stations, right? They're pretty inexpensive, and it just makes a big difference if I don't have to, walk 150 feet to get to a bag, and there's one within 15 feet every time, right? Or something like that. So I think that's one big thing. But again, just setting the expectations is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Go on.
I was just going to say as well, so because one thing we've observed is that where people are allowing their pets to foul and then not clean up after them, it affects certain places in our development rather than others. And so this isn't based and born out of any kind of data as such, but I do sometimes wonder whether it's a cultural issue in that we just haven't yet properly educated those particular individuals as to what are the greater impacts beyond the dog mess being on the floor, because there is a greater impact there, based on perception of what people how they view the environment, based on that we have a lot of families that exist within our spaces. So kids, as I'm sure many people in the room will be aware of, will touch and pick up pretty much anything. So it's all those kind of things that exist, and that I think maybe perhaps just a little bit more education. It could just be something as simple as a sign, or indeed, like you as you suggested, the inexpensive waste stations where you can just deposit it. Then I know one thing that we do is we try and provide doggy waste bags on our front desk. So it's just you've popped out, you've forgotten it in your apartment, just stop by the front desk. And we're more than happy to provide it, and it's inexpensive, so it's not a huge burden to us to then be able to provide that free of charge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the element, isn't it, in terms of the sort of profit and performance. These things aren't huge cost. Benefit, enormous. And the caring that it demonstrates. In one building I went to in the US, it actually got water bowl for a dog, or dog water bowl by the reception, so the dogs could actually have a drink as they got there, and food, etc. And it just makes a world of difference.
Yeah, I mean, those little things make a big difference in terms of people's perception of, even if they walk in for a tour and they see a water dish there, it's going to make a big difference for them in terms of, hey, this is a place that I want to bring and live with my pet.
Yeah, absolutely. Caroline, anything you want to throw in?
Yeah, I think it's really important that when we're looking at these sort of small details, they're also going to be singing out to the type of people that you probably want to be in the apartments who might have pets, the committed pet parents, the ones who are raising their pets as children, and that's such a the kind of the humanization side of animals has grown so much over the last few years, and those are the sort of people who aren't going to be a problem in terms of not being dedicated to clearing up after their dogs, not being mindful of their dog's behaviour and its impact on those around them. And by just putting in those touches, you are creating a community that's going to be welcoming those type of people, I think, and sort of setting that precedence up.
And it's almost like graffiti, isn't it? Where if you leave graffiti, the first piece up here, and not move it, it will breed more graffiti. Whereas if people showed that the area is cared for and it's got rid of straight away, you just stop that happening, and the kind of whole care and attention is the same thing. Any questions from the floor while we're going along? Yes, Howard. I don't think I could read that sign, actually. I didn't think about that from this distance. Oh, 5, thank you. Howard.
Thanks, Roger. For the first time in my career, I've been to a session on pets, which is that's a milestone in itself.
Yep.
You touched on the subject of licence fees and rents. What is is there a UK best practice? Does the UKA advocate any particular approach to the charging and licensing of pets?
No, the best practice guide at the moment doesn't have a piece in about. It's coming, but it isn't there yet. And it's interesting, there's a mix of operators and approaches at the moment. So some will do pets free of charge and not make any additional charge at all. Some will charge a pet rent. Some will charge a license fee, a sort of one-off license fee like a tax. Some are charging rent deposits. Some are not even charging pet deposits. So at the moment, there is no commonality and no fix to say what is right or what is wrong. But what is interesting, and this comes through more and more, and kind of Ross alluded on it as well with the US, what people think is pet friendly is way off beam. And that's the interesting piece, and that's where I think there's a trick being missed by a lot of communities at the moment. And whilst you've got high demand and low supply, everybody's happy. The moment you start to get anything approaching the mix of that and people actually not getting rentals, then the pets become more important, because if that's a way to attract people in, so it's kind of building in the economics of these things. Yes, sir.
Hi there, this is Stan from Knight Frank. supporter of pets and would love to recommend more clients to take them. But question is, what would you advise? I mean, Farouk, have you had any experience of other residents complaining about being allergic to pets in, say, shared spaces? And how would you contend with that?
Yeah, I mean, that has invariably occurred from time to time. So part of our pet policy means that we ask that residents respect some of our rules whereby pets aren't allowed in all spaces. In communal areas, for example, if they're going through there, walking through there to get to another area, another place, they have to be on lead. But in some of our social spaces, we just don't allow pets there full stop because of exactly that reason. There are people who will be allergic.
And I think that's the aspect in terms of it's being sympathetic. So you embrace the dog, but you've got to look after your non-pet owners as well, and make sure that you're accommodating everybody. And most of the projects that are coming forward have got space to accommodate it if it's designed in. Now, you're thinking ahead when you're building now for those spaces, aren't you? You're actually planning that into them.
Exactly. We are. And I think, you're right. It is about kind of looking at it from both sides. In the same way that when you're creating a tasting menu, you take into consideration, your vegetarian, your vegan, your meat options. Is essentially what we're doing here. You want to kind of keep both sides happy. And I haven't, after the initial growing pains where people were perhaps not so certain about, can we bring our pets here, can we not? Once you got through that, you educated people a little bit, just had a chat with them on the front desk, and perhaps sometimes they were like, well, we don't understand, why can't we have our dog here? And then you just took some time to speak to them and say, look, well, this is why, there's going to be some people who are a bit afraid or have allergies or whatever the case might be. People are by and large very receptive. I don't think I've yet to come across anyone who's, fighting against that.
But explaining things to anybody generally overcomes that hurdle and that handicap.
Just explaining it and then also seeing it actually play out that way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, yes, sir.
Rules whereby residents aren't allowed to leave their dogs in the flats during the day while they're at work. They have to take them to a doggy walk or whatever.
We do in our pet policy say, look, you don't leave your dogs unattended or on the balcony, and it kind of speaks to taking care of the pet, properly. Obviously, there's exceptions like things like cats, but for things like dogs, we do advise, and that's why we have those facilities and amenities in place, whereby they can take them elsewhere, because we're trying to encourage them to not leave them in the apartment alone for God knows how long.
But presumably it's because it's a barking issue potentially, right? And so
exactly.
So I think that it's a nuisance, right? And so these things fall. I mean, if you look at it, it's a nuisance, and all residents, all of our renters have the expectation that if there's a nuisance, we're going to have to address it, right? And I think you treat it the same way. If the dog's barking, then that's a problem, and you have to deal with it, and that's fair, and that's in the policy, right? And so it's also a dog welfare issue, right? And so I think that's, but I also think it's important. You want to be careful, probably not to maybe pass that judgment on it, right? Because then it puts you in a different position, it puts you at risk potentially of getting involved in a way you maybe don't want to be involved. But yes, you're right, absolutely.
Anything you want to add to that, Caroline?
Sorry, the line's breaking up.
Anything you want to add? We're talking about leaving dogs in the home when people go to work and things like that.
Yeah, and I think this is where there's obviously an opportunity to create either extra services that are provided within the community, or by making relationships with local pet professionals who can provide daycare, walking, those sort of services. Also, through companies like ourselves, where we can provide that sort of insight before the person is getting into the situation where their dog's getting stressed, by able to guide them through how they can support their dog the best that they can is also really important. So I think a mixture of education, provision of services, and kind of creating a wider community. I know friends who live in apartment blocks in London who have neighbours who want some company during the day, and they look after their dog for them. So being able to make networks within the building can also help support those situations.
There's probably businesses starting up in the communities as well, actually dog walking. Right. Any final thoughts? Caroline, let's go down the line. Caroline.
Yeah, so I think it's just really about making sure that there's the education in place, that there's a supportive community in place for the people who are going to be living with dogs, as well as those who obviously who aren't. And all of the things that I'm hearing are just incredible in terms of the sort of stuff that Quintain are putting in place to support like pet parents be successful. I think once we put those things in place, then there wouldn't be any issues moving forward.
Yep, Farouk?
Nothing in particular. I think just because this topic is about pets, it's just an interesting tidbit. But you know, as I said before, we have 425 pets, 229 of which are dogs, 196 were cats. And so you can see there that the difference between the two is not actually that great. I think intuitively you might think that there would be a greater number of dog owners than there are cats, and although you would be right, the difference between the two is not that great. And so I think perhaps in moving forward, questions should be asked. What also can be done about that? So cat owners can also have something to kind of integrate with one another into the community as well.
I agree with the thing about cats, right? They're definitely underrepresented in terms of the thinking behind what happens there. The one thing I would just ask is consider reviewing and maybe changing your pet policies, right? And a lot of them we find in the U.S. have not been even looked at for 10 years or more. And so things are in place because that's the way it's always been. So take a look at it and see, is this what we really want right now, given where we are with pets, with pet population growing as much as it is?
There you go. Whoever thought that cats are underrepresented? So all the minorities we're talking about and all the EDI we're doing, we've got to be looking after cats as well. So we've got to throw EDIC probably in now. Thank you very much for attending and listening. Don't forget, pets can be a performance and a profit. So good luck to all of you and enjoy the rest of the day.